Why is the president addressed simply as Mr. President? That's the question for today. And the answer is, well, let's consider what the alternatives might have been, what the alternatives were sometimes proposed. If you should go to meet Queen Elizabeth, then you will probably address her as Your Majesty. And if you go to see the Pope, it's Your Holiness. And if you refer to some other person, it's His Excellency or His Highness or His this, her, that, this, that, or the other thing. And very often, heads of state, important figures, like to have titles sort of added on. So, in fact, the full title of the monarch of Britain is something that just goes on and on and on, and used to include I can't remember what the term, Empress of India and all this other stuff. And there was this supposition, I guess there was the supposition on the part of the people who came up with these practices of these long, fancy titles, that somehow they made you more important than if you had a simple title. And there were people who thought the same way back in the early days of the American Republic under the Constitution. The Constitution simply says that this person shall be President of the United States. That's it. It doesn't say how you should address him if you're introduced to the president. And so this did come up. In fact, it was one of the first things that Congress talked about when it got together in the very first Congress after George Washington's inauguration. So what are we going to call him? Everybody knew him as General Washington, but he's now President of the United States, so we're not going to call him General anymore. Do we call him, what do we call him? And when the Senate, for example, sends a message to the president, or if the president comes to speak before Congress, how is he introduced by the Speaker of the House or by the President of the Senate? So what are these forms? And among those people who thought that the president ought to have a real high resounding title was John Adams. John Adams, I have a hunch that John Adams didn't yet think that he was going to be president of the United States himself. He was vice president. Maybe he did think he was going to be president of the United States, and maybe he was thinking about how he would like to be addressed. But he thought it was really important for the president to have an exalted title, because the way he put it was that if you want to encourage the best people in the country to run for this office, to accept the office, you have to really offer him something. And the pay of the president wasn't going to be that great, so a lot of people then, actually, and much later, who became president would actually take a pay cut in becoming president. So what are you going to offer them in exchange? Now, by the 20th century, by the 21st century, the president has become the center of the American political system for so long that it's kind of accepted that, boy, talented people, ambitious people are going to want to be president. But it wasn't clear in the 1790s that who would want to be president. This was at the very beginning of the government under this new Constitution, and the important thing in Adams's mind was making sure we attract talent, attract good people, people who can actually carry out the functions of the office. And so he said, we can't offer them money, at least not much money, but maybe we can offer them these high resounding titles. And so the Senate debated this, and they came up with a formula that included protector of the liberties of Americans, and a couple of other things like that. The House of Representatives said, forget it, we're not doing this at all. And the House of Representatives then, and to some degree as now, the more popular of the two branches of Congress. In those days, the House of Representatives was the only one of the two that was elected by the people, whereas the senators were chosen by the legislatures of the states. That would change at the beginning of the 20th century. But even today, being a member of the House of Representatives is a smaller deal because you have to go back to the people sort of every other year. And there are more members of the House of Representatives, so it's not as exclusive a club. And so the House of Representatives from the very beginning said, no, we're not going to accept these titles. This is a republic. And a republic is a system, well, if we follow Thomas Jefferson's rule, where all men are created equal. But furthermore, it's one where political power rests on the people. The United States in the 1790s was not yet a democracy where ordinary people actually exercised political power, but it was moving in that direction. And members of the Republican Party, many of them liked the idea of democracy, that the president is no better than anybody else. This was the philosophy behind the rejection by the House of Representatives of the idea that the president should be called His Excellency or His Highness or His Majesty or anything like that. The House of Representatives insisted on simply calling the President of the United States. And if you meet the President, if you're introduced, you could call the President Mr. President. You're not going to call him Mr. Washington, no, because of the office that he holds. So you call him Mr. President, but not Your Excellency, you're not Your Highness, or your, for heaven's sake, you're not Your Holiness or anything like that. So this was what the House of Representatives insisted on, or more precisely, what the House of Representatives said was, we're not going to agree with that highfalutin stuff that the Senate, and especially John Adams, want. And so Congress split. Congress was roadblocked on this, and Congress couldn't come up with what the president ought to be called. And so George Washington was the one who actually imposed his views on this. And interestingly enough, George Washington was as much an aristocrat as existed in the United States. He was perhaps the wealthiest man in the United States. He was the most accomplished man in the United States. And if anybody could claim to be a member of the elite, an aristocrat, it was George Washington. And in fact, in his personal dealings, he used to portray himself that way. Gouverneur Morris, a politician from Pennsylvania, used to tell stories, and he was a party guy, and he was a hail fellow, well-met person. And he used to tell stories on himself about how there are some occasions when he would try to loosen Washington up. And so in fact, he's supposed to have wagered an expensive dinner with Alexander Hamilton, and this story is set at the Constitutional Convention, and Morris and Hamilton have this difference of opinion on whether Morris can get George Washington to be just one of the guys. And Morris says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'll bet you that I can loosen General Washington up and get him to crack a smile and, just get off his high horse, so to speak. And Hamilton says, fine, I'll make you the wager. And whoever loses has to buy the best dinner in Philadelphia for all of his friends. So Morris goes up to Washington and claps his hand on his back and says, hey, George, how's it going? And Morris would subsequently told the story himself, and at that moment, I knew that I had made a grave mistake. Washington turned his eyes on me, and with an icy stare, and not saying a word, he took my arm and removed it from his shoulder. And it was all I could do, said Morris later, it was all I could do to slink out of there, and I would never risk doing that again. So Washington cultivated this kind of aloofness, but he didn't carry it into insisting that people address him by some fancy title. He simply said, basically, call me Mr. President. And that's the precedent that was established, and that's the one we have until today. It is pretty much as democratic, as egalitarian as you can get. So, Mr. President, well, and for generations, even starting then, when you were introduced to anybody else, this is Mr. Smith, this is Mr. Jones, this is Mr. So-and-so. And the President of the United States took the position, I'm no better than all those other people. Before the eyes of the Constitution, I am simply Mr. President. And that's how it came to be.